The King of Kings wouldn't be good enough to show toddlers in Sunday school, and somehow Charles Dickens' son Walter is more annoying than Judas was. At least Judas had the decency to leave the story after his betrayal. Let's walk through this plot, shall we? We open on Charles Dickens performing a dramatic reading of his Christmas Carol in front of a live audience, when he is rudely interrupted by his cat and sinful son Walter. Charles Dickens stops his performance to deal with distractions, and because of his son and cat's disobedience, the story he is currently writing, his story of Jesus, ends up all over the backstage. Mr. Dickens promises his son Walter that he will be discussing this with him when he gets home. And when he does arrive home, his wife informs him that Walter is waiting for him in his study. When asked why, Mrs. Dickens says that he should tell him the story about Jesus that he wrote, because the story of Jesus teaches, and I quote, forgiveness and understanding, amongst other things. When Mr. Dickens enters his study, it becomes abundantly obvious that Walter is not at all sorry for his actions, and only wants to listen to a story if it's about a king. Luckily for him, this movie is called King of Kings, so on with the story. We start with Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, and an angelic revelation to the shepherds, and then are immediately told about the wise men who arrive in Jerusalem looking for the child who was just born, the King of the Jews. King Herod tells them to report back when they find him, but when the wise men visit Jesus, who is still in the stable, and then dodge the king on the way out, Herod feels threatened and orders the death of all the babies in Bethlehem. But don't you worry, Joseph is warned to escape 25 seconds before the soldiers come and kill his son, and the whole family is able to escape to Egypt because God protects them. The Dickens family keeps interrupting the flow of the story, which usually adds nothing of value, but this time it's used to explain the celebration of the Passover. Basically, Charles Dickens tells his son to just watch The Prince of Egypt because it's a much better film. Then he continues the story of Jesus as a young man in the temple. We then jump ahead to Jesus when he was 30, when he was baptized by John. I don't think it will provide any value to continue on explaining every story told to us, so I will simply list them all, only pausing when there is significant character or thematic relevance. Jesus fasts in the wilderness for 40 days. Jesus is tempted by Satan. Jesus calls his disciples, who all look like they've made out with a weed eater. A blind man is healed after Jesus says that the man is blind in order to show the power of faith. Demons were cast out by Jesus. Jesus forgives the sins of the paralytic, then heals him, which then prompts the Pharisees to plot against Jesus. The story of the adulterous woman is here, which I would have advised against because it's not in our most reliable manuscripts, but here it is. We then have the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus confronts the followers who want to be fed. We have the miracle of Jesus walking on water, with Peter being able to walk to him, but Peter gets spooked by the storm and waves and then immediately begins to sink. Jesus picks him up and tells Peter, "Have faith in me and you will be saved." We then get Peter's confession that Jesus is the Christ, and Jesus tells his disciples that he will die. And it is here that we get our first mention of Christ dying for sins. Jesus then raises Lazarus from the dead, prompting the Pharisees to plan his execution. And I know I haven't been commenting very much about the plot, even though throughout most of the film, Charles Dickens is sort of explaining why he thinks Jesus is doing what he's doing. But when we see Mary washing Jesus' feet, there is nothing. I've racked my brain for a week trying to figure out why some of these stories are in here and nothing is explained, and I've got nothing. We then see Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Then we get to witness my absolute favorite part of the entire Bible. And I'm sure every Christian is in agreement with me. It's the part where Walter Dickens loses his cat in Jerusalem, and his father, Charles Dickens, finds the cat and then turns into Jesus from the perspective of his son. This scene also has been driving me crazy for a week, and I'm about to talk about it more later. Real Jesus goes into the temple and overturns the money tables and promises to rebuild the temple in 3 days. Jesus washes the disciples' feet. Then, during the Last Supper, Jesus once again tells his disciples that he will die. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prays, then is betrayed by Judas, and he then heals one of the Roman guards. Walter then interjects with a very important question. Why does Jesus have to die? Mr. Dickens then explains the creation of the world and then the fall of mankind, which brought sin into the world and separated us from God. But there is no mention of personal sin and any foreshadowing of repentance. Jesus is tried by Caiaphas, the high priest. Peter denies Jesus. Judas tries to return the money he accepted from the Pharisees. Jesus is whipped, and then he is put on trial again by Pilate, who announces him innocent, but is persuaded to condemn him to death by the crowd. Pilate offers the release of Jesus to the crowd, but the murderer Barabbas is chosen for release instead. Jesus carries his cross to Golgotha and is crucified. While on the cross, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." One of the criminals who was dying with Jesus asks Jesus to remember him, and Jesus promises him paradise. Jesus cries out, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" And then he says it again in English, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And right before he dies, he says, "It is finished." At this point, Walter gets all teary-eyed, and Charles Dickens continues the story, which is Jesus, already risen from the dead, walking out of the tomb and passing Walter. We get a nice little parallel with Walter drowning, similar to Peter, and Jesus saving him by this time taking his place, while we hear the same message he told Peter, "Have faith in me, and you will be saved." Then Walter is overwhelmed by the story of Jesus. He feels the tremendous weight of sin he has committed, and begs God to save him, and promises to live his life in service to his Lord, the King of Kings. Oh! Whoa, I am so sorry. That last part doesn't happen. Instead, Walter gets very happy Jesus rose from the dead, and goes to tell his siblings the story of Jesus, and that's the end. Judging this film's plot completely on its own, it's not bad. I hate most of the Dickens interjections into the story, but it was very helpful twice, and I would argue necessary for the purposes of explaining very important information about the biblical story. Not when Walter stopped the story to ask what a manger was. I was wanting to bang my head into a wall when that happened. But when Charles Dickens explained the fall of man, I was very glad that it got its own time to be explained in a way younger children would understand. You know what young children won't understand, though? The message of the film. Because I barely know the message of this film. But sticking strictly to the plot, I'm going to give it a score of 6 out of 10. Almost everything flowed together very nicely, minus the Dickens interjections, and some narration aspects were done very well. But there were also a lot of poorly explained segments that really needed better narration, or less, or more likely none at all. Let's talk about the animation. From the trailers, I thought this thing was going to look horrendous, and it's not that bad. The animation looks very clean, but the style they went with sucks. Every one of the disciples looks like they've been hit by a truck, and then undergone 2 years of plastic surgery. I do like it better than modern Pixar's bland style, but only slightly. It's like the creators of this film watched Ratatouille, and instead of learning how to properly style characters based on their character traits, they learned, oh, we need to make everyone look funny. But the best part of the animation was that they cleverly wove in the Dickens characters into the story. They were a part of the story, and they used various different techniques of showing how the biblical story progressed. They had the story's characters small in the real world before transitioning to the story which they were now a part of. The way Jesus was taken up and tempted by Satan, I thought was very well done. I'm going to give the animation of this film a 4 out of 10 because I can't get over the horrible style of all the male characters. It really pulls you out of the movie every time the disciples are on the screen. Now, let's discuss the themes of this movie. To start out with, was there a theme? Well, from the intro of Walter and Charles Dickens, it was very clear that Walter needed to learn obedience and discipline. But that is 100% not the theme because it's never touched on again. Mrs. Dickens says the story of Jesus has a lot to do with forgiveness and understanding, but forgiveness isn't the focus of the story because Walter never learned he needed to be forgiven. You might think, oh, that's what sin is, and you would be right, but in this film, personal sin isn't even hinted at. Charles Dickens explains original sin and mankind's fall, but he never tells Walter that he has personal sin that needs to be forgiven. This is the most important message that should have been in this film but wasn't. So, what was the message? Well, I've got a theory. One might be tempted to think that there's not a message, it's simply a collection of stories for the sake of learning about the life of Jesus. First off, if that was the case, it would be impossible to hide clear messages from Scripture, which is why remnants are still prevalent in this movie. Secondly, not having an obvious message might be an attempt to appeal to a wider range of audiences, which is not a bad idea. However, there is one scene where I think it's too obvious what they were trying to subtly have people take away from this film. Remember that scene that I lied about and said that it was my favorite, where Walter loses his cat in Jerusalem, and when he looks back at his father, he sees Jesus? What does this mean? I believe the whole film was meant to show Jesus as an example for us. From the very first healing, where Jesus heals a blind man, it's apparent something odd is going on. In the Bible, when asked why the man is blind, Jesus says, "It is so the works of God would be revealed in him." But in the movie, Jesus says, it's to show the power of faith. Having Jesus as an example for us Christians is a great message to have, but not at the expense of the most important message in the Bible. And it is for that reason I am giving King of Kings a 3 out of 10 for its themes. And I should emphasize, I have pored over my notes over this film, trying to make sense of any other themes in this film. I desperately wanted to connect a salvation message. I simply couldn't do it. Jesus being an example for Christians was the clearest thematic element I could find in the whole film. A couple of random things before I give my final verdict. Oscar Isaac was the best part of this film, and it wasn't even close. His voice felt powerful, and his deliveries were spot on to what I would have wanted from any depiction of Jesus. The animation, however, doesn't match up with his voice most of the time. The best example is when Jesus overturns the tables in the temple, and his voice is furious and has so much emotion behind it, especially when he is prophesying about his resurrection. But if you were to watch this scene without any sound, it would come across as Jesus being mildly upset and looking loony rather than having a righteous anger. The shot of Jesus dead on the cross was the best in the film. They had him die directly facing the camera, and after he breathed his last, the camera slowly angled sideways while rotating around Jesus to show him hanging over the crowd. Lastly, I am glad that although the Dickens family portion of this film was very much intended to simply keep children entertained, the stories of Jesus were still presented in a respectful manner. The writer at least had enough foresight to have Walter stop being cringe when the focus was on Jesus. For my final score, I'm afraid I'm going to be giving King of Kings a sad 4 out of 10. Just go watch The Prince of Egypt, it makes this film look like the 11th plague. Then go watch Jonah if you want to watch another better biblical film. And if you want to know how accurate the Jonah movie is to the biblical narrative, click right here to watch my analysis of it. Thank you all so very much for watching, and I'll see all of you subscribers later.
I'd like to tell you a story, son.
If it's not about a king, then I'm not interested.